The prosecutor in Taylor Schabusiness trial is going to remind us why she needs to get life with no parole. Now, we haven't watched the trial, and it's been like, what, a couple months since she's got her verdict. And I initially was like, okay, well, maybe she should, I don't know, maybe she can change somewhere down in the future. Maybe let her out when she's like 50, 60, 70 or something like that. But honestly, I forgot about a lot of the facts in this case. And again, reminder, just how heinous this crime was, just the trauma that Shad's family had to go through, especially his mom finding her son's head in the bucket. So this is going to be the state prosecutor's recommendation for the sentencing of Taylor Schabusiness. And I think he does a really good job at kind of like summarizing everything that has happened so far and things that have happened in her life before she was arrested.
I'll turn to the state for a sentencing recommendation.
Thank you. So ultimately, the state's recommendation is that the defendant not be eligible for release at any point to extended supervision. Shad's death in this case, I think, is really one of the more egregious, frankly incomprehensible. There is a bad choice. There is a decision in a moment of anger or whatever it is to pull a trigger on a gun or to hit somebody in anger. And while that intent exists when they're committing that act or when they're pulling that trigger, it's sometimes rather fleeting. The manner, as we heard from the defendant herself, explain how she ended Chad's life. This really wasn't a bad decision. It was a series of conscious efforts. It was continued effort over, as she said, 3 to 5 minutes, as she's telling and describing for Detective Groff and Detective Kemp, pantomiming how she's pulling harder, how she's glibly talking about how he's turning purple, and I liked it. I'm pulling harder. He's coughing up blood. I'm pulling harder. I kept going. I was waiting for him to die. This really is an involved process. It's a method of ending another person's life that really is quite significant. There was this level of trust and friendship and familiarity between the two, which I think is just really makes the acts of the defendant really incomprehensible in that respect. You have
it's not like
obviously the method of ending his life was significant and serious, but the impact of her subsequent acts would have on Shad and his memory, on his family, on this community, really, to engage in the acts that she did with his body. Which I'm not going to comment on what those are. The court and counsel are aware of what happened and the systematic and organized and laborious efforts she undertook. That's nothing we've seen in this county.
And the fact that she dismembered him with kitchen knives, like that was like Shad's like mom's like knives and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, butter knife, other knives that they had.
I imagine in many counties have seen acts of callous brutality like that, but really a lack of remorse or understanding or appreciation, I guess, is in some respects, of the conduct that she's engaging in. We saw her calmly describe what happened, at some points being rather glib and smirking about what she had done. As we see later in the PSI, having very little remorse for what she's done. And ultimately, the defendant, we've heard a lot about drug use and mental health history, which I'll comment on later. But really, the defendant herself is telling us why this happened. And it wasn't because methamphetamine, it wasn't because of mental illness. She's telling law enforcement why this happened. It happened because she liked it. It's because she wanted to do it.
I think she is cuffed, but I don't think it's like the Murdoch one where they're cuffed to their their waist. I think she's cuffed, but she's able to like kind of move up and down.
To hear the things they've had to hear and experience the things they've had to experience, I think is tremendous. So the thought of the defendant having perpetrated this act and impacting them in that way, I think is incredibly concerning. It was heartening, as I've been the prosecutor for many months on this case and reading the PSI, getting to know more about Shad, and I want to comment on that because, unfortunately, the case we've heard, really everything we've heard about him has been in the context of what Taylor did to him. And it's really unfortunate that that's the memory that some people will have about him. And again, that's a result of the defendant's acts.
Can you guys hear that? You could just like hear her like sigh like really loudly.
In some respects, really tinge the memory that some may have of him. And I don't want that to be the case, but we heard the good. We heard how he was a good and a quiet kid, how he would always hug his dad on the way out before he left the house, how he would read and knit and crochet with his younger sister. And that's the person the defendant took out of this world. For all the talk about how young the defendant is, Shad was 24 when he passed. So all the things we hear the defendant wants to experience in life, she still has that opportunity in a confined setting. And simply put, Shad does not. There are 3 prior convictions. She was just placed on probation 6 weeks before this offense. And appropriately so. In reviewing the complaints, she kicked an officer. There's indications of methamphetamine or other substance abuse that led to that conduct. She then, in the fleeing case, fled at 80 miles an hour down the downtown Green Bay when it's populated with bar patrons and other pedestrians walking down the street. She's hopping curbs. She's not stopping. She's blowing through red lights. Again, there was indicia that drug use was at play there. And those were both in 2020. So as we heard earlier, there was ample time in reviewing the materials. Efforts were made to address the underlying substance abuse issues. She was placed on probation, and really nothing of much was accomplished in that short period of time. The little that was accomplished, she absconded from electronic monitoring. She cut off the bracelet, and really then obviously engaged in this conduct. So,
Oh, I forgot about all this history that she had before.
the state agrees that, considering this idea of rehabilitation, and that's always a goal, but in some respects, that opportunity was afforded both during the criminal cases and in reviewing all of the materials at many points throughout her life, and unfortunately either was not followed through with, was not taken seriously, and I think that's a concern going forward. We consider the background of the defendant, and I echo the comments earlier. That's not a childhood, that's not an early adolescence that anyone should have to go through, and that's, it's difficult to hear some of that stuff. But when we consider that sort of background information, unfortunately, we deal with a lot of people who have substance abuse issues in the criminal justice system that lead them to make choices they wouldn't normally make, that leads them to become thieves or become burglars or become misdemeanor offenders. Really, I'm not sure we have a nexus here between that underlying substance issue or mental health history and the conduct that we're sentencing her for today. Certainly, we've had a lot of litigation or testimony about the mental health history of the defendant. The court-appointed experts called a majority of that into doubt, and obviously the jury disagreed that there was any mental disease or defect that led to this behavior. And I comment on that because it's one thing just to say this person has a mental health history or a substance abuse history, and it's important to note, but really why that's relevant in sentencing is it's sometimes a nexus or it's a explanation for one's conduct that maybe then would lead towards maybe rehabilitative efforts. I'm not sure in the case there's that nexus between the prior drug history, mental health history to the extent there is one, and the defendant's conduct here. It appears there was methamphetamine use, we don't know how much, and we don't know, given some of the comments of the defendant after the fact, how much that impacted her decision-making. Certainly probably didn't help, but we, as the doctor said today, we've now had this long period of essentially forced sobriety, and we're seeing aberrant behavior throughout that time. Certainly, obviously, nothing to the extent of what she did to Shad, but I comment on that because, yes, there are those histories, and rehabilitation is always a goal of the criminal justice system. And I would think most people in the public and in the state certainly would agree with that.
Yeah, I think initially I was like, oh, I'm not sure, but like if she got parole, maybe when she's like really old, maybe like 50, maybe 60, something like that, but I'm not sure. But after listening to him, I'm like, okay, yeah, no parole. You're right. No parole.
It's the first option as a response to addiction, to low-level offenses. Rehabilitation is a primary goal. Rehabilitation, while important, should not be a primary goal for the courts in this case. And I say that in part because of what the defendant did. I think criteria like punishment and deterrence and protection of the public are more primary factors. But it was very concerning to not only hear the defendant talk about the offense to law enforcement, but the comments that were made in the pre-sentence report, which, as I mentioned, I think evince just an utter lack of remorse for what happened.
Well, she's 24 right now. So from 24 and her to get out in her like 50s and 60s, that's her is like old, because that's like many, many, many years down. A lot of things that she's going to miss in her life if she's in jail for that long.
We have no idea what Schabusiness will be like in 2040, 2050, 2060. But that's just one of the factors the courts can consider. To only think in those terms neglects the other criteria, neglects what she actually did in this case, the moral need for punishment, the need for deterrence, the need to protect the public from somebody doing that to another person in this community. Really, in light of these circumstances, I think the department's recommendation for Ms. Schabusiness not to be eligible for release is appropriate.